course, most of you know me as a political scientist, but a couple of years ago I went to this place in the north of Scotland called Orkney and fell in love with archaeology. So I decided to get myself a Master's of Letters in Archaeology at the University of the Highlands and Islands. And as part of that, of course, I had to write, as they call it, a dissertation. In my Neolithic Studies class, I had to do a poster presentation and I decided to do it on Neolithic violence. Don't know why. But it got me interested in the topic and I wanted to keep doing that. So when I was choosing my topic for my dissertation, I thought, well, I'd like to study violence against women. In my Women in Politics class, we do domestic violence, we talk about sexual assault. I'm a sexual assault survivor. So I started, reading more about Neolithic violence, and I kind of noticed that there wasn't really that much about women. And so what I decided to do the dissertation on was, it's kind of a feminist critique. I kind of moved beyond that as well, of the studies of violence during the Neolithic of Europe. And you're going to learn about what this is in a minute. So it used to be that we used to talk about the Neolithic as a very peaceful time, where you had people living in nice egalitarian little communities, engaging in trade and things like that, and it kind of seemed to fit with the ideology, right? Particularly after World War II, it was like nobody, we wanted to know that there was this time in Europe that was really peaceful. And then we discovered some mass graves, and they dated to the Neolithic. And so people started thinking, well, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't such a peaceful time. And so what we've seen since about the 1990s is a depacification of the Neolithic, where people are starting to recognize that there was a lot of violence going on. The question is really kind of what kind of violence, because one of the things you're going to see is that archaeologists, when they study violence, have this tendency to want to see war, whether war is there or not. Okay. Anyway, and I thought, okay, well, what about the women? Because we have stereotypes about women as being, much more submissive and peaceful and all of that kind of thing. Though we're starting to see evidence of otherwise today. So I thought, well, okay, let's look and see what they've been doing and look carefully at what's going on with how they deal with women. So a little bit on the archaeology and the study of violence. So for me, I needed to distinguish between interpersonal violence and war. So interpersonal violence is not only physical violence between persons, but it can also be structural violence, so not being able to get access to food and other resources that are needed. And another definition of violence is like war, which tends to be intergroup rather than intragroup. And most of the time when we think of war, we think of people who actually have weapons, which didn't exist in the Neolithic. They had lots of tools that could be used as weapons. They didn't have like swords, for example. And there's a group of people, right, normally men, who are the warriors, right? So there are differences between those. Now, what can bioarchaeology do for us? Well, mostly when it comes to studying violence, we are limited to the bones, right? There's no flesh, which is a big problem because not all violence shows up on the bones. But we can learn a lot from the bones. We can, for example, distinguish now between ante-mortem and peri-mortem trauma. That is trauma that you survived, ante-mortem, so you survived it and it healed up before you died. Peri-mortem means it happened right around the time that you died. May not have been what killed you, but it happened around the time that you died. We can also, some of this is an art. distinguish between accidental, intentional, taphonomic, that would be damage that's done to the bones while it's in the ground, or maybe being pulled out of the ground. We can now, we can look at cut marks, and we've learned to distinguish between intentional cut marks and the gnawing by animals. We can determine sex. We can determine their age at death. A lot of new work, and this is relevant to what we talk about when we talk about women and violence, the strength that somebody had, and this is done usually through the connections between the muscles and the bones will show up in certain ways. We can learn what diseases they have. We also have stable isotope analysis, which can tell us a lot about what these people were eating, what their diets were, whether they moved around, right? So for example, if they were raised in one place and died in another place, they're going to have a different, isotope analysis than people who stayed in that same place where they died. But there are a lot of limitations. One, of course, is preservation. Some places preserve bones better than others. Fragmentation. This is a real problem in Orkney because we think they may have actually intentionally fragmented, or we know at least that they moved the bones around in the tombs. And another problem that we also get in Britain, because here we have usually communal tombs in the Neolithic, is how representative is the burial population. And this is going to come up in one of the studies that I do. Actually, probably the major problem with the studies that I found is that most of them lack some kind of social theory. That if they have any at all, it's androcentric and patriarchal. That is, they just take their 20th, 21st century ideas about women and slap them onto their data. There's also gender archaeology, which I distinguish from feminists. So gender archaeology just says, oh, well, let's actually pay attention to the women, and see what's going on there, but without a feminist perspective. Feminist archaeology focuses on women, tries to see things from the perspective of women, and it's really a form of interpretive archaeology, which I don't think we have time to get into. We could spend a whole semester on it. So let's see, I think I've got it all there. All right, now I'm not going to go through all of these because I just don't have time, but these were the studies that I actually looked at. There were, I think, 8 that were site-specific, and then this number of ones that were either focused on a particular culture or a country, or some regional studies, and some actually take countries or and then combine them into regional studies. So here's some European cultures and things like that. But let's move on to the more interesting stuff. So we're going to start with the LBK and the corded ware massacre sites. The LBK is the linear bend ceramic, I think. And most of the sites here are from the late LBK, and the corded ware came after, which is around 5,000 BCE. They still use BC and AD over there, though. But we're going to start with Talheim. Okay, Talheim is the first massacre site that was found. And then we're going to look a little bit at these. I'm going to leave out Halberstadt. So these are all places where mass graves have been found. And they all date to right around 5,000 BCE. A little bit about the LBK. They lived in these long houses, usually several of them, 4 or 5, in a little village. They tended to always position the door in a particular direction. It could either be southeast or to the east. So even as they spread, they continued, this same orientation of their houses. What's important, though, when we're looking at stuff, because is how they buried their dead, and so just a little bit about that. Here I'm going to have to use some notes. The LBK actually had various burial rites. Of course, because they existed for a pretty long time, and so they, different groups did different things. So that they had single graves, double graves, multiple burials. Some were isolated, some were in cemeteries. The grave goods assemblages often varied. Sometimes there was secondary burial. Sometimes there was cremation. So they really did it all, which makes it difficult to come up with a theory of burial. They sometimes, and let me move this on, they would actually build their settlements over previous burials, or they would even bury people in the structures. This would vary between the early and the late LBK, how they did these things, as well as regions, okay? One thing that was very common, however, in LBK burials was that most of the dead were buried in a crouched position on their left side with their heads pointing east. Though each site seems to have some exceptions to that. And grave goods seem to vary based on sex and age, okay? Well, what about the LBK people? There is a large cemetery in a town called Vendravik that has been studied by a fellow named Borick, who uses Levi Strauss's notion of house societies to look at the LBK. And he says basically there were egalitarian social arrangements that were based on kin-based groups, affines, and foreigners, right? So these were not just locals, right? That people moved around and developed, to these settlements. That he says the people of Vendravik were involved in a significant amount of exchange of goods and information from regions that often were many, miles away, distances away. And that there were a large number of immigrants or travelers, that is, people who lived most of their lives in other places, but who died and were buried in Vendravik. He also noted that there were dietary differences based on the intersection of sex and age. Okay, so that younger women ate less meat, but by older age, the older women were eating the same amount of meat as men. Okay. Now, and this is the interesting thing. What he says, his idea, is that what this represents is that less meat was better for having healthy children. Okay? I don't know. I gotta look more into that. Okay, and my point here is that this is his idea. Okay, just that there was a kind of a nutritional reason for that. Now there could be other reasons for that. And we're going to see those occur every once in a while. Okay.